Okay, we are now live on Facebook, so maybe we could start.
So, welcome everyone. Good night. Welcome to this webinar on the role of international law in tackling the environmental crisis. We are very honored to count with such a brilliant panel of oralists. And on behalf of the organizers, I thank you very much for accepting the invitation. This webinar is co-organized by three entities: LIDERA, Global Pact Coalition, and Common Home of Humanity. Just a few words about each one of them. LIDERA is a community of young leaders from different professional backgrounds, from deputies, scientists, lawyers, public figures, etc., that intends to inform and to empower towards an acceleration of the climate transition in Portugal. LIDERA believes that solutions built in a transdisciplinary environment are much more likely to solve problems. The Global Pact Coalition is an NGO building a far-reaching civil society movement to promote the Global Pact for the environment. The coalition is also working for having the most ambitious declaration adopted in 2022. Last but not least, Common Home of Humanity is an NGO conceived to build a global transformative movement to create the needed structural conditions for a collective action for our civilization to safeguard a well-functioning Earth system within a global transdisciplinary effort. This having been said, I will briefly introduce our speakers. We have with us Professor Patrícia Galvão Teles, who is a member of the UN International Law Commission, as well as a law professor in the Autónoma University of Lisbon. We have Professor Makane Mbengue, who is the director of the Department of International Law and International Organizations of the Faculty of Law of the University of Geneva, as well as member of the Curatorium of the Hague Academy of International Law. Paulo Magalhães is the founder and director general of Common Home of Humanity. I remind that after the speakers' interventions, we will have a Q&A session. We shall now proceed to the intervention of Professor Patrícia Galvão Teles, who will talk about the role of principles in international environmental law. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to be with you tonight. It's really an honor to be talking to you about the role of principles, and in particular the role of principles in international environmental law, their function and their importance. You will hear a bit more in a moment about the Global Pact for the Environment, but the Global Pact, as highlighted in its last preambular paragraph, the need to adopt a common position and principles that will inspire and guide the efforts of all to protect and preserve the environment. So the pact would be an important instrument to allow the main principles of international environmental law to be enshrined in a solemn text in environmental issues. They're known, and we will talk about some of them, but they must be strengthened, harmonized, and respected at the international level. Some of these principles are the right to a healthy environment, the principle of precaution, the principle of prevention, the polluter pays principle, the right to information, and the rights to public participation and access to environmental justice. In this process leading to an instrument that could be the pact or a declaration, we'll see that also in a moment. There has been an important development also through a report that was prepared by the UN Secretary General, which was a report on gaps in international environmental law. And this report also contributed to the clarifying the importance of the reinforcement and strengthening of the principles of international environmental law. This report that was prepared a couple of years ago, it stressed that principles of international environmental law are important building blocks and their usage is widespread. But there's some work to be done. For example, some of these principles are included in non-binding instruments, including political instruments, while others are included in specific issue-specific multilateral environmental agreements that are legally binding. So it would be one idea behind the pact would be to have those principles in one single legally binding document. They can also be strengthened, being clarified and being more easy to interpret if they are in a legally binding instrument also by the national judge, which is also an important value added that a legally binding instrument could bring. So in this report also we have the same type of principles that are, as I mentioned before, either in non-legally binding instruments or in sector-specific instruments that are enunciated along the same lines that I also mentioned, including others like the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities or the principles of non-regression and progression. So there are a number of principles that we know and that have been used, and they're not all at the same stage of development, including, for example, the question of a right to a healthy and clean environment, which is something that is now on the table of the Human Rights Council, for example, for its recognition. So this report has pointed to the importance of clarifying, unifying those principles in a single instrument in order to facilitate their application at the national level, to better harmonize them and to ensure predictability and certainty. However, despite this diagnosis and despite the process that was launched and that will be discussed afterwards for a global pact for the environment, so far it has not been possible to gather the necessary consensus for the negotiation of such an instrument. And so for at least for now, the aim would be to adopt a political declaration in 2022 when we celebrate the 50 years of the Stockholm Declaration and of the creation of the United Nations Environmental Programme. So in this event, states could adopt a declaration on the environment, including on the principles of international environmental law. Of course, this would not be a legally binding instrument, but it would be an instrument that could, and there has been a resolution of the General Assembly also that has started this process towards a declaration in 22. It mentions specifically that this work should recognize the role of discussions on principles of international environmental law in enhancing the implementation of international environmental law. It also said something, and here I have to make a bit of a parenthesis because this resolution 73/333 also mentioned the ongoing work of the International Law Commission on general principles of law. And this is, as a member of the Commission, something that I feel that I need to clarify a bit, because what we are doing on this topic of general principles of law, which is a source of international law, will deal especially with general principles that are common to the different legal systems, to the domestic legal systems. It will also look into the general principles that might be formed in the international legal system. And of course, international environmental law, like for example, international humanitarian law is a preeminent example where principles have developed in the international legal system. But the work of the International Law Commission will not contain specific principles. They can be mentioned as examples, but it will not come up with a list of specific principles. It will be rather more as a guide for the identification of such principles. So there isn't really a duplication of work, and the work of the Commission will be certainly different in this respect. So ideally, when we think about what's coming next, it would be to have a legally binding instrument for the reasons that I already mentioned. But it seems like at the moment, it's more likely that at least as a first step, we will have a declaration that will be political, non-binding, but it would be very useful that such declaration would highlight those principles. And if one thinks of the interaction that we can have between the so-called soft law and hard law, declarations, political declarations many times serve as what Professor Ann Peters has said, it as a pre-law, as a paralaw or law plus. So it could be also a way for later having a legally binding instrument when the political atmosphere allows for that to happen. So we've had other cases where we had important political declarations stating principles of international law. Perhaps the most well-known is Resolution 2625 of the General Assembly of the United Nations on the principles of international law concerning friendly relations and cooperation among states. And some of these principles in this declaration, like the principle of sovereignty or the use of force, they also come from the United Nations Charter, of course, a treaty, but others, for example, like the principle of self-determination, was not in the Charter, at least its regime, more developed regime, and it was rather developed through UN resolutions and then finally codified in this latest resolution of 1970 that just this year also, well, last year just completed also 75 years. So it's important to not undervalue, in my opinion, the role that political declarations could have. Of course, it would be very useful if we could have the Global Pact for the Environment as a treaty outlining these principles, also for the benefit of the national judge and legally binding principles. But if that's not possible, or until that's possible, it would be very useful to have these principles codified in a political declaration, hopefully next year when we commemorate the 50 years of the Stockholm Conference. So I would stop here, and I look forward to listen to the other panelists and to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your excellent intervention. We shall now proceed to the intervention of Professor Makane Mbengue, who will talk about the origins and the content of the Global Pact for the Environment. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Flavia, and many thanks to the organizers for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me to share this panel tonight with Patrícia and Paulo. Well, let me just start by saying that the idea of a global pact for the environment is not a new idea. Also, the idea of having a universal, comprehensive, and binding legal instrument regarding principles of international environmental law is not a new idea. Actually, the international community has been pursuing such a quest since 1972. 1972 was the year of the very famous Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment, that launched the international environmental protection agenda. And one can say that since 1972, the international community has been searching for this binding, universal, and comprehensive legal instrument with respect to principles of international environmental law. So it was not surprising that in 1987, when the Brundtland Commission published its very famous report, Our Common Future, it was not surprising that the Brundtland Commission in 1987 actually emphasized in its report the need to consolidate and extend principles of international environmental law through the adoption of a new charter. And what I'm saying now is exactly the words of the Brundtland Commission report. No, it's the Brundtland Commission report, which in 1987 emphasized the need to adopt a new charter that would consolidate and extend principles of international environmental law. And what was interesting is that the Brundtland Commission in that report, Our Common Future, called the international community to adopt a universal declaration and a convention on environmental protection and sustainable development. So there was already this idea of having a global comprehensive convention on environmental protection and sustainable development. And in the report of the Brundtland Commission, there was an annex, Annex 1, where a list of legal principles were listed that would have served as the basis of that convention on environmental protection and sustainable development. Unfortunately, we know the rest of the story. In 1992, at the Rio Conference on Environment and Development, the international community decided not to be that ambitious, not to adopt a universal declaration and a convention on environmental protection and sustainable development, the international community limited itself at adopting the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, which was, of course, very much less ambitious than what was foreseen by the Brundtland Commission. So what does it mean? What does it mean? It means that principles of international environmental law till today are characterized by certain legal deficiencies. Professor Galvão Teles was mentioning the 2018 report of the UN Secretary General on gaps in international environmental law. That report actually emphasized that there are deficiencies. The UN Secretary General used the word deficiencies when it comes to principles of international environmental law. So what we are facing today are deficiencies when it comes to these principles of international environmental law. And I can summarize the deficiencies at three levels: lack of clarity, lack of certainty, and lack of predictability. I think that this is what we can see in terms of deficiencies. The lack of clarity that is characterizing principles of international environmental law, the lack of certainty that is characterizing those principles, and the lack of predictability. And the lack of certainty, the lack of clarity, and the lack of predictability affects not only the meaning, they affect not only the meaning of principles of international environmental law, but that so-called lack also affects the content of principles of international environmental law and the legal status of principles of international environmental law. Let me just give you a concrete example of what I call lack of clarity, certainty, and predictability when it comes to the meaning of the principle. Just think about sustainable development. Just think about the principle of sustainable development. We are living in an era that is supposed to be an era of sustainable development. We are living in an era where the international community is supposed to achieve sustainable development goals. But what we see is that till today, the international community was not able to reach a consensus on what is the meaning, what is the definition of sustainable development. Throughout the years, you have different approaches, different perception within the international community on what is sustainable development. So how do you want the community of states to achieve sustainability when the international community itself is not clear on the meaning of what this principle of sustainable development means? Then I was also mentioning lack of clarity, lack of certainty, lack of predictability regarding the content, or if you prefer, the scope of the principles of international environmental law. Many of those principles are not clear when it comes to how they should be or how they must be implemented. Just think, for instance, about the obligation to conduct an environmental impact assessment. So yes, there is a consensus to say that states under customary international law have to conduct, or at least to require the conduct of environmental impact assessments before authorizing hazardous activities. But then when it comes to the content, when it comes to the scope of how to conduct an environmental impact assessment, then we are facing their legal uncertainty. Then the last problem I mentioned was the lack of clarity or certainty or predictability regarding the legal status of principles of international environmental law. As Professor Galvão Teles was saying, many of these principles are characterized by uncertainty when it comes to their binding effect. It is not clear to which extent states are supposed to comply with them. It is not clear to which extent international courts or even domestic courts are supposed to take into account or to apply those principles. One very good example, good illustration is the precautionary principle or the precautionary approach. Till today, there is no clear consensus on whether precaution is part of customary international law. You would have certain international courts who would say, yes, it is crystallizing in customary international law. And then you would have other tribunals who would say, no, 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 you know, this is not at all part of customary international law, and it doesn't have to be applied in the context of certain disputes that are involving environmental aspects. So this is what we are facing. And this is why today it has become, I would say, rather urgent to revive, because once again, it's not a new idea, to revive this idea of having a global, comprehensive, universal, binding legal instruments that would give certainty, clarity, and predictability to the principles of international environmental law. So this is the reason behind the Global Pact for the Environment. The Global Pact for the Environment is, I would say, a new initiative that has been launched in 2017 by the Environment Commission of the Club des Juristes. The Club des Juristes is a French think tank, and it is the Environmental Commission of the Club des Juristes that has revived this idea of having a global pact for the environment that would allow for better, effective, and efficient implementation of principles of international environmental law. So this draft global pact, because it's a draft, this draft global pact for the environment was drafted and finalized, as I said, in 2017 in Paris, when lawyers from more than 40 countries. Also, I think we were more than 100 lawyers for more than 40 countries from the north and the south that met and drafted this global pact for the environment. And our work was very much welcome by President Macron from France, who actually endorsed, who actually believed that it was important that the international community took the steps of adopting a global pact for the environment. And this is how the whole process of negotiations and discussions started within the UN. And I would be very happy to come back on some of these elements of the process. But for now, to finish my presentation, I think that in terms of content, I would say, and Patrícia is very familiar with this language because it's the language of the International Law Commission. But I would say that in terms of content, the draft Global Pact for the Environment is both an exercise of codification and of progressive development of principles of international environmental law. Codification of principles of international environmental law, but also progressive development of the principles that should govern environmental protection at the international level. What do I mean by codification? When you look at the Global Pact for the Environment, you will see that some of the principles are principles that are already well established in the system of international environmental law. If you think about prevention, it is in the Global Pact for the Environment. If you think about the polluter pays principle, it is in the Global Pact for the Environment. If you think about public participation, access to information, access to environmental justice, so all these well-established principles are contained in the Global Pact for the Environment. So the Global Pact for the Environment is not necessarily reinventing the wheel. It is consolidating, reinforcing well-established principles of international environmental law. But besides this codification approach, you have also the progressive development. The Global Pact for the Environment is innovating by pushing forward certain principles that should be core foundations of environmental protection at the international level. The right to an ecologically sound environment. Very important. There is still not today a universal recognition of the right to a healthy environment. The Global Pact also innovates with a duty. The Global Pact is not only talking about rights, but also the duty of states, the duty of international organizations, the duties of non-state actors, etc., to take care of the environment. But also innovation when it comes to the principle of resilience. When Paulo is going to talk about climate change in a few minutes, and resilience is very important today in any efficient agenda for environmental protection. The principle of non-regression, making sure that states never go back in terms of environmental protection. We've been seeing recently in certain countries that when some new administration came, they tried to question the level of environmental protection that was already achieved. So these are new principles that are not so well established, but that are fundamental if we want tomorrow to have a healthy planet. So this is what the Global Pact for the Environment is trying to achieve. You know, the UNEP very recently has published a report that was entitled Making Peace with Nature, Making Peace with Nature. Well, one way to make peace with nature is to use international law. International law can be a decisive tool for the planet, for we, the people of the United Nations, to finally make peace with the nature. And this is what the Global Pact for the Environment is about. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Makane. So now Paulo is going to take the floor and is going to talk about the legal recognition of a stable climate and the paradigm shift. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation and to talk after Makane, Professor Makane and Patrícia. As Professor Makane said, we are on the progressive side of the Global Pact. We participate in all the discussions, in all the meetings in Nairobi. And as one of the, I always, when I start to talk about the Global Pact for Environment, I like always to mention one delegate in the meeting with you, delegate of German. And when he asked, besides the question of the principles, because the idea of the Global Pact is very innovative for international law. For the first time, we have one holistic way to address the environment as a whole. And until now, law has no answer for this question. What is the global from a legal point of view? Okay, and this is why I will address the question of the Global Pact also in the climate, as the delegate of Germany said. What we are talking about climate, about biodiversity, about oceans, about plastics. We are talking about everything, or we are only talking about gaps. Okay, this is the great challenge for the Global Pact. And I think when I was there, I was always trying to introduce the idea of the Earth system that is different from the planet, as we will see. And the Earth system does not exist for the law. And this is why. And a stable climate is a manifestation of a well-functioning Earth system. I have some slides to share with you. I ask for permission to share my, sorry, this is to share my screen. So the question of what we are talking about from a legal standpoint, the planet is a territory with a surface of 500 million kilometers square, divided among states. But from Earth system science, besides the physical planet and the territory, we have a system, okay? And this is the system that supports life on Earth. All the planets have a territory bigger or smaller than Earth. What makes this planet different from all the other planets is the system. And this system does not exist for the law because we still see and consider this planet from a legal standpoint as a married territory where the commons are only the leftovers of the divisions of states. So to explain the complexity of a system like this, to explain the complexity, to be able to explain the reality of this planet, probably we have to go further from a married territory approach to the planet from a legal standpoint also. So, and the question of the system of being intangible is not the first time that is addressed. Professor Simon Borg has already said that international law is not able, is ill-equipped to address intangible natural resource like a stable climate that spans across and beyond the national borders of states. So the question here is that when we talk about a stable climate, what we are talking about from a legal standpoint? This is the question. A stable climate is a visible manifestation of a well-functioning Earth system, is a pattern of stable and predictable dynamics of the Earth system. Sorry, this is okay. And why is intangible? The way how matter moves around the planet, creating these stable circulation patterns that corresponds to a stable climate, can only be classified as an intangible asset. Okay, what we are seeing here is what is a stable climate here from in the left side with a stable polar vortex, and what is happening in the North Pole, what is unstable pattern. This is a stable climate, this is unstable climate. And what is the common good that we should talk about here when we said that an unstable climate is a tragedy of commons? The question is, because this good that we are talking about, the stable climate, is something intangible, is a pattern of circulation of the atmosphere and the oceans. It's not considered by the law as a common good. It does not exist for the law as an object of law. And to explain this, a pattern of stable and predictable dynamics of the system that corresponds to a stable climate is absolutely impossible to divide, even in a purely abstract legal terms. We can divide airspace, we cannot divide the composition of the atmosphere. We can divide the space of the seas, but we cannot divide the quality of the water, the biochemical composition of the water of the seas. So this is a stable climate. It is a common good, not only from a legal standpoint, but also from an economic point of view, because it's exhaustible. And a stable pattern and the tragedy of the commons. This is a difference between, this is our main common good and the tragedy of the commons without being accepted yet by international law as a common good. And we can explain this difference to distinguish what is the legal view of the planet as the hardware and the software. We can divide the hardware, the space of the seas, the space of the land, and the space of the air. We cannot divide, even if in a legal abstract way, the system itself, the software. And, sorry, and we are proposing that the Earth system itself is considered as a common intangible heritage of humankind. And this is also not the first time that international law have the opportunity to consider for the first time to accept the existence of a common good that is compatible with the territory of states, but to accept that we have a global common without borders that spans across all the borders and must be managed as a common good. And this makes all the difference when we are analyzing the policy related with climate change. In 1988, for the first time, when the issue of climate entered in the UN, the first question was, what is a stable climate from a legal standpoint? And the first proposal was to consider a stable climate as a common heritage of mankind. It was a proposal from Malta in 12 of September in 1988. And of course, if this proposal was accepted, it will be one of the most revolutions in international law. For the first time, we will accept an object of law that exists at the same time, inside and outside of the sovereignties. And the question was that, because we do not accept that we have really a common good, independently of the law to recognize or not, it's a common good that must be managed as a common good, as we will see. We invent a derivation from the concept of the common heritage, and we consider, international law consider not the stable climate, but rather the climate change as a common concern of humankind. And climate change, for example, in the convention, in Paris Agreement, the first rule, the first norm of the Paris Agreement is to say that climate change is a common concern of humankind. And let's try to understand what is the difference between being a heritage or being a concern of humankind. I think, as we will see, a stable climate is much more. It's so great relevance that must be much more than a simple concern of humankind. And let's see the difference between one thing and another. In the system of a concern, each one will try to make less damage because they are concerned, but they do not recognize as a common good. The rule is each one will say that I will try to make less damage to avoid this problem, because we are concerned. And then in the end of the day, each one will try to make less damage, but the sum of less damage, it's always a damage. It's a negative sum game. Or we have another alternative. We have a zero-sum game. This is the market, the carbon market. I have the credit. If I do not use my credit, I will sell my credit, and the emission that I will not make the emission will be done by another one. This is another dimension of the concern approach to climate. Another approach, another dimension is I make the emission and I compensate my emissions, for example, for a capture of carbon by a forest. Okay, this is a zero-sum game. But the forests that have no conditions, the forests that have no emissions, that are able to pay by the work of capturing these emissions, they do not receive from anyone, and we are cleaning in a legal voice. It's like, as Nicholas Stern explained, in climate change, we have the biggest market failure in the history of economics. And the reason is this legal void, that the stable climate does not exist for the law, and to make positive impact for the benefit of everyone is not recognized as a benefit for the common good. So we do not have any scheme of payments for negative emissions to clean the atmosphere for the benefit of everyone has no value. The only way to put value in the work of nature is to have one emission, to have someone that is able to pay to make the mitigation or to make the absorption of that emission. We need to have a negative emission we have to have one emission for the capture of carbon to have value, because cleaning for the benefit of everyone has no value. And with this solution of the concern approach, it's impossible to have what we really need: a society that is able to clean and to restore a stable climate for the benefit of all mankind and the next generations. So we have already recognized intangible natural common goods in outer space law, like the orbit of geostationary, the orbit of moon. And the question is, why can't we recognize that nature is not only what we can see, it's not only we can touch, and nature as the software, nature, the pattern of stable dynamics of the Earth system that corresponds to a stable climate, is our most outstanding global common that should be considered as a common good. And this should be the basis to build a system of governance in a global scale as a new object of international law and of international governance. This is our main proposal, and we think that the Global Pact, besides the roles in terms of principles, besides the roles of the codification of no regression, of progression, of all these principles that are essential for our common future, we need to, the Global Pact is also a great opportunity to define the global common that should be managed in the name of everyone of the next generations. So we have already the legal tools, the scientific tools that are needed to define the safe operating space for humankind. Like, and I think my time is finishing. Our proposal is to use the safe operating space for humankind defined by the planetary boundaries as the common heritage of mankind, the intangible common heritage of mankind, and under this heritage to manage what are the positive impacts and negative impacts that everyone makes makes on the Earth system. And this is the second main rule to have a successful management of commons, to have a congruence between the provision of the common good and of the common good. So thank you so much. And no, I'm open to any questions and to open the further discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Paulo. We will now watch a short video about the Global Pact Coalition that Suzanne is going to show. And right after that, we will proceed to the Q&A session. So I invite the participants to think about the questions they would like to ask, whether in the chat, whether raising your hands in Zoom and asking directly the questions to the speakers. And we would maybe give preference to this last option in order to dynamize a more interactive environment. So Suzanne, if you can show the video.
Have you ever heard of the Global Pact for the Environment? It's an international treaty the United Nations is talking about. The pact is supported by scientists, professors, students, celebrities, artists, and many climate advocates who all believe that the time to act for our planet has come.
The bad news is that some states oppose its adoption.
But the good news, there's still a chance. The people's movement can push states to act and adopt the Global Pact for the Environment. Let us tell you why and how.
In 2017, jurists from around the world came together to draft the Global Pact for the Environment, a legal text that proposes a set of mandatory rights and duties for all to protect the environment.
Citizens, cities, businesses, NGOs, associations, and states. Rights and duties for all, because we are all responsible. Because after 50 years of declaration and treaties, efforts to protect the environment and life on Earth are clearly insufficient.
Because air, soil, or water pollution doesn't stop at country borders. Because beyond our difference and our origins, all living beings form the community of life on Earth.
Because on a daily basis, we witness the collapse of biodiversity and put life on Earth at risk. Because climate change threatens our way of life. Because we must act now, together, and use the law to help us.
Because we need to ensure our planet's ability to produce renewable resources for generations to come. And because our societies are structured around the law, we must recognize at the global level the essential principles of environmental protection.
A pact that can become the foundation of a new social contract for humanity. A contract that allows us to protect the environment because it's the best way to bring people the possibilities of a better life.
A pact that recognizes the right of everybody to a healthy environment, that recognizes the duty of states and citizens everywhere to take care of the environment.
A guiding compass that will enable access to information, justice, and process for citizens of the Americas and the world.
A pact that answers to young generation, civil society, all of us actually, because we need to lay the foundation for a new and more united world to better protect our planet and mankind. We have proposed a global pact for the environment.
We had support from political figures who brought this idea all the way to the United Nations.
In May 2018, 143 countries voted for a resolution
that paved the way for negotiation.
For more than a year, delegates from United Nations member states have met to discuss the necessity of the pact, but not everyone was on the same page. Certain states wanted just another declaration, not a binding treaty that would require effective action.
In the end, the states couldn't agree. In May 2019, they chose not to choose. For them, it wasn't the right time to adopt the pact.
Despite the first defeat, not all hope is lost. A public movement can change that.
2022 is our new target. The pact will be rediscussed at the next World Summit.
From now on, citizens, volunteers, youth, public and private institutions, all will have to act in support of the pact.
We need to continue to support the pact more than ever, everyone, until it is adopted and implemented. Because the principles of the pact seek to address our current path of global irreversible transformations.
By supporting the pact, we will show the states that we are ready, that everyone is ready. Starting now, all together, let's demand that states assume their responsibility and adopt the Global Pact for the environment.
Because there is only one planet, we have no other choice. Today, the time has come to adopt a Global Pact for the environment.
Let's demand that the states recognize our right to a healthy environment. Join the Global Pact Coalition. Sign up and share this video.
One planet, one pact.
One planet, one pact.
One planet, one pact.
One planet,
one planet, one pact.
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 One planet,
One
one
planet,
pact.
one pact.
One planet, one pact.
One planet, one pact.
So we can now proceed to the Q&A session. We already have one question here in the chat. I think it's for Paulo. It says, thank you for the updates. Given the global scale and transboundary nature of commons protection and restoration, how are issues prioritized? It's from Nick Anthony.
Okay, the question is, I think that we have, before how I will answer this, the first step, we have already one Nobel Prize in economy, that is Elinor Ostrom, that defined the conditions that are needed for a successful management of commons, okay? And the first step, she wins the Nobel Prize in economics against all the traditional economics approach that we still have, that considers that the commons are inevitably a tragedy of the commons. So the solution is the privatization and is privatization and division. But when we face a good like a stable climate, we cannot divide it even in the abstract way, in the legal abstract way. The only solution is to manage it as a common good, okay? And the management of common goods have rules. She wins the economics of the Nobel of Economics because she made what are the structural conditions that are needed for successful management of a common. The first one is obvious, is to define the common good. The second one is to create the conditions that allow to have rules for congruence between provision of the common good and appropriation of the common good. And we do not have none of these conditions with the global common, with a stable climate. Who provides a stable climate, who has forests, who has ecosystems, are making a provision of the common good that everyone uses. and who use this common good do not pay, and who make the provision do not receive. So without these first conditions to be possible to manage a common good, it's impossible to achieve agreements. It's impossible to be successful in climate change, for example. For some reason, we have 25 years of negotiations without results. One of the main things that Elinor Ostrom said is, nobody is the sucker. And in the management of commons, we have the first step is to define the common. As UFC, we refuse to accept that a stable climate is a common good, and we made the option to consider as a common concern. This is the reason why, for example, Elon Musk earns more money selling the credits, CO2 credits, than selling cars. Because he earns money because he do not make pollution, okay? Who are providing the common good itself does not receive nothing for this. And with this scenario, it's very difficult to achieve one agreement. It's very difficult to change one economy, to manage a global common that without borders that we all depend. I think this is, okay, I have no more time for the answer, sorry.
Thank you so much, Paulo. So Gonçalo has a question.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. My question, I think, may be answered by every one of you. I think I understand the Global Pact for the Environment is a set of rights, duties, and principles. But I also would like to understand if there are any good examples of laws already implemented in any countries, rather than only principles. For example, in Portugal, we are discussing now in Parliament the possibility to have a law that sets the duty of the government to have a climate budget, I mean a carbon budget, to be discussed every year or in 2 or 3 years. So questions like this, for example. Thank you.
So I don't know if Makane, do you want to answer?
Okay, let me jump on this. Thank you very much, Gonçalo, for your question. You know, I think what you raise as a question comment is the distinction between, you know, bottom-up approaches and top-down approaches. You can of course sometimes say, you know, leave it to the states, leave it to every single government to think about, you know, its domestic approach on how to protect the environment, adopt national legislation. That could be one way of doing it. You know, if you take the Paris Agreement, for instance, today, the climate change regime is based on bottom-up approaches where every country is communicating what it is intending to do in terms of mitigating climate change or adapting to climate change. And then we will do an aggregate of all that and see if it works or not. What we know is that it won't work. What we know is that it won't work. Leaving it to every single government to say, oh, this is what I will do, this is not the right solution for the protection of the global environment. The right approach for the protection of the global environment, as Paulo was indicating, we are talking about a global common. So when we are talking about global commons, the best approach is a top-down approach, where you have international commitments, where you have clear international rules or principles that then have to be implemented at the domestic level. You know, for instance, why many of us are pushing for the principle of non-regression? It's because we've been having clear examples very recently. Just think about what happened in the United States of America with the previous administration, where the previous president came and low down, you know, put down all the environmental achievements that were made by previous US administration. So the principle of non-regression, what does it say? It tells governments, well, you know, no matter who's in power, no matter the government, when you come, you know, when it comes to environmental protection, you can always grant better protection, you can always reinforce protection, but you cannot go to a lower level than what was already achieved in terms of legislation, etc. But for that, you need international law. For that, you need a top-down approach. You need clear international commitments that would prevent states to change the rules of the game whenever they want to change the rules of the game. So this is why we can't just leave it all to domestic laws. Thank you.
If I can just add something, I mean, I fully agree with what Makane said, but I would also stress the important role of domestic law. I think there has to be, I mean, I think the Global Pact would be a bit to put the roof on top of the building. So the importance of the principles, so that you have the harmonization and you have the clarity and the predictability that was mentioned before, and also the path that is not so dependent on political and domestic politics. I think that's very important and a common standard. But at the same time, I think it's also very important that countries have good domestic legislation concerning climate change or other issues. It's also very interesting that even in certain areas, like, for example, the recognition of a right to a healthy environment, sometimes domestic law is more advanced than international law, because many constitutions, including the Portuguese constitution, recognize already that right. And so I think it's very important for countries to have good domestic legislation concerning climate change, also because the side that now it's quite evident in terms of the possibility to litigate for nature, in favor of nature, and in favor of states taking more measures concerning climate change. And we're seeing that it's mostly in domestic courts, like in the Netherlands or in Ireland or in Australia. There's a number of very interesting recent cases, and also through the regional human rights courts that have also in this interconnection between climate change, environment, and human rights. So I think it's also very important from that point of view that there's good national legislation, because certainly it's not going to be possible. And I think that's, I mean, it's a question that it's very interesting. It's not, bringing, I get that question sometimes, and I'm sure that Makane also, probably Paulo, how can we take a state to court if it fails to meet the Paris agreements at the international Paris agreements objectives? I mean, at the international level, it's very difficult, not only because of the nature of the obligations in the Paris agreement, but also, there's the principle of consent to international jurisdictions is very strong, very linked to the question of sovereignty. And so it's probably easier to bring these cases in domestic courts. And so that's why it's also very important to have this complementarity between what's stipulated at the international level, but also at the national level.
Yes, let me say here something. Here in international law, in the international scenario, is the problem of collective action. And this is very difficult. And we must and the only way to achieve it is to respect the rules that allow to collective action to happen. And this is why it's so important to have this global pact, okay? Because I talk about the first rule, the second rule for a successful management, and the third rule is to have the capability of predict the behavior of others. You understand? I only will change my behavior if I can predict what will be the behavior of others. And this is useful not only for a group between us, but between the group of countries. You understand? And this implies to have one global pact where it's possible for everyone to predict the behavior of others, to change my behavior. Because if I work in a country, and I restore my biodiversity. I make my investments restoring my forests, my biodiversity, my ecosystem area. The benefits will be spread for everyone, and the others will continue to say the sea, and I will share the damage with everyone. So I will be the loser. Okay, so the only way to achieve something in a global system like we live on is to have one global agreement for everyone to be able to have a collective action. You understand? Because it's impossible. If I am the Prime Minister of Portugal, I will restore all the ecosystem. In the end, I will be a loser. Okay, because the others will not make the same. So this is the great challenge of our age. This is the great challenge for international community, because we are all interdependent on each other in a global scale. This is the great challenge. This is why we need a global pact.
Thank you so much. So since it's already late, maybe we'll take one last question. I don't know if anyone here in the chat, because we also have some questions coming from Facebook. Yes, so if nobody wants to ask any question, okay, I'll ask this one. So we have a question from Salah Jarun. It's quite a broad question. It's on the linkages between environmental law and climate change. How can the law change to better tackle climate change? Which is basically what we've been talking this last hour, but if anyone wants to answer.
The answer that I can give is, I think that the first reason, or the structural reason for the tragedy of the commons, that is climate change, is a tragedy of the commons in a global scale, only to address a climate as a common, to make the conceptual evolution in international law, to accept something that exists for the law and that is inside the sovereignties and outside the sovereignties as a common good, is the base, the conceptual step that is needed to address climate change.
Thank you, Paulo. Now it's really the last question. Tiago is asking if he can ask the really last question.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. First of all, thank you to all the speakers. It was really great to hear you. I wanted to know, as a young person, what can I personally do, or like what can our generation do to support the role of the law to fight for the climate change?
Thanks, Tiago.
I see you can join the Global Pact Coalition. I mean, our friend and colleague Jan Aguila, who has been the driving force behind the Global Pact for the Environment, and also President Laurent Fabius is not here, Jan, because he would be better than us in promoting how you can do that. But I think if I can jump, Felipe, jump back on your question, because it's a very important, I think, aspect, also in relation to the Global Pact for the Environment. The Global Pact for the Environment, as I was saying, is not only focusing on rights. It's also, it also speaks about duties, and one of the major duty that is there is the duty to take care of the environment. And in this context, the Global Pact for the Environment contains provisions on the role of non-state actors, subnational entities in implementing environmental principles. We should not think that the implementation of principles of international environmental law should only be left to states. It shouldn't only be left to states. Non-state actors, everybody has an interest. Everybody has an interest for principles of international environmental law to be implemented. So the Global Pact for the Environment actually calls upon states to make sure that non-state actors, meaning non-governmental organizations, universities, etc., promote, implement as much as possible the principles of international environmental law. One of the principles of international environmental law is, for instance, environmental education. So, for environmental education to be effective, you need universities to develop, environmental education. You need universities, for instance, to develop climate education. So I think what your question highlights is the need for everyone to be involved in the implementation of principles of international environmental law. And this is also the whole idea of a global pact. It's not called the international pact, but the global, because once again, as Paulo was saying, we are talking about the common heritage of humankind when we talk about our planet. So it's important that everybody acts for the safeguard of the rights of present generation, but also for the safeguard of the rights of future generations.
And if I can, I would also add the video that you've showed is quite clear on the reason why there is not yet a global pact for the environment. And that main reason is lack of political will from some governments. I wouldn't say all governments, because there were many states that were supportive of the pact. Since, this is an event in Portugal. Portugal was one of the co-facilitators of the discussions that were meant to lead to a pact and that failed. But the problem is really that there are some governments that are not keen on having a legally binding instrument. So I think the role of public opinion in general, civil society, including of young people, the future generation, I think it's extremely important in gathering the support with the governments that are supportive of the idea, but also changing the minds of those that are opposing the idea. Because the problem, I think, in international relations in general is that you have the big majority of countries support, you have a big support, and then you have a more reduced number of countries that are not supporting, but they are very vocal and they're very difficult. So in order to promote this consensus, I think the role of public opinion, including from the young generation that is very active in environmental issues, in climate change issues, I think it's very important role to be played. So joining the Global Pact Coalition, speaking about it publicly through NGOs and through contacts with the press, I think we need that to try to break the cycle. But it's not just on this item. I think in general, we're in a moment, and it's very clear from us standing from the International Law Commission point of view, that it's very difficult at this moment to convince states to enter into new legal commitments. There was this moment of opportunity, this very last moment, which was the Paris Agreement. And after that, since 2015, there haven't been any major agreements. So I think public opinion needs to change this global moods of states not having an appetite for due conventions. Certainly there's a need in this area and other areas. And it's a question of political will. So that's, I think, what we need to change.
Let me say also, Tiago, when I was in the meetings in Nairobi, I remember perfectly that the first Friday for Future was take place when we were there in the meeting. And I believe that it was great and friends that help us to not kill the pact in Nairobi. Without the young people on the streets, if the pact, we are still talking about the pact, and something that was postponed now for the declaration for 2022 in Stockholm. I believe that a key role was made by young people on the streets. I remember that one delegate that was talking with me, her daughter called him asking for permission to go to not go to the school and to go to the Friday for Future, and he didn't give permission. After half an hour talking with him, he gave the permission, and you know, the things change like this. So Greta, without knowing this, she played a huge role in the discussion of the pact, because he's not there, but it's on the street, and this has a high political relevance. So this is very important, because if we are waiting for the states to change the game between them, we will not. We can wait on the seat that we will not have great news. So civil society has a great role on this, and young people, because you are young, you are the future generations, you have a really political role to play on this game. So you have a huge role on this, and participate also on the Global Pact Coalition. It's very important to see young people on these issues. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Paulo. So LIDERA is trying to do its part, and so I invite everyone to join the coalition, to visit the website of the Global Pact Coalition, the LIDERA's one, as well as Common Home of Humanity one. And once again, I really thank these speakers for having joined us on a Sunday night. We are a very crazy community who likes to have their meetings on a Sunday night, and we really appreciate it, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Everyone. Thank you for joining. Have a nice evening.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Flavia, for moderating.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Bye.